Hi, my name is Barry Vogel, and I'm the Executive Director of Audio and Loudspeaker Technologies International. Welcome to today's ALTI Association webinar presented by Rosemary Coates. Rosemary is a management consultant, a best-selling author, the founder and Executive Director of the Reshoring Institute. She's the host of the Frictionless Supply Chain podcast and was awarded one of the 100 most influential women in Silicon Valley in 2024. Rosemary is a popular keynote speaker on reshoring, nearshoring, and global supply chains. And with all that, Rosemary is a longtime friend of Alti Association and me. Feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. And this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Alti YouTube page sometime next week. So without further ado, Rosemary, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Barry. I'm glad to be here today, and we're going to talk about a really popular and interesting topic, and that's using tariffs as a geopolitical weapon. I know we've been in an environment that's been discussing tariffs extensively and the economic effect. We're going to go through that, but also a little different perspective because tariffs are being used differently these days. All right, so here we go. Maybe. Okay. There we go. So this is a little bit about my background. I'm the executive director of the Reshoring Institute, and I also have a consulting firm where I do a lot of expert witness work and global supply chain consulting. I've been doing global supply chain work and management consulting for more than 30 years and have worked with over 80 clients worldwide. I also have written 5 books on supply chain management. The one in the bottom right corner, Legal Blacksmith, I wrote with an attorney a couple of years ago. As I mentioned, I do expert witness work, and we were working on a case together with the attorney, Sarah Rathke. And one night we were at dinner and she said, let's write a book together. And so we did. And the first part of each chapter is on the functions in supply chain, such as forecasting and planning, procurement, warehousing, etc. And she wrote the back half of each chapter, which is about the legal precedent and the clauses that you should have in your contracts and so forth. So it's quite a handy sort of desk reference, I think, for people. All of these are available on Amazon. Okay. The Reshoring Institute, just a little bit about us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit and nonpartisan organization. We try to play it right down the middle and tell you like it is what's really happening in the manufacturing world. And we provide research and consulting services for companies that are rethinking their global supply chains and possibly bringing manufacturing back to America. We also, half of our mission is to take graduate student interns and we teach them about global manufacturing and sourcing. And you can see below, these are the 18 universities that we currently are affiliated with and have taken interns from these universities. So we have a kind of an academic approach, but also a hands-on training for graduate students because they're honestly going to be the business leaders of the future. So we take graduate student interns both from MBA programs as well as um, master's in engineering programs, and spend a semester. They spend a semester as paid interns, and they help us do our research. Okay, so let's get started with tariffs. First of all, what was the original purpose of tariffs? So originally, back before 1913, tariffs were the major source of federal income. So that's how we ran the government, was on tariffs, which seems unbelievable now because there isn't that much money that's generated from tariffs. But that's the way it worked until the federal government established income tax in 1913. So it was the primary source of revenue. And originally, the idea of tariffs was not only to support the government, but also to protect domestic industry. So by putting up a tax at the border, it essentially made imported goods look, although artificially, but look artificially more expensive because of this tax. and therefore giving domestic industry that might be less efficient and cost more, give them a break so they could compete in for sales in the U.S. So the original intent was to, to provide some protection for domestic industries as well as some revenue. Early examples, the Tariff Act of 1789 was the first major legislation that was passed regarding the tariffs. And it stated that the need for tariffs was to support government, discharge debts, and encourage domestic manufacturing. Okay, so fast forward to today, tariffs are still used, but they are not a major source of US government. It's really a very small percentage of revenue goes to the US government because of tariffs. And their primary purpose is related to trade negotiations and retaliatory measures and protecting specific industries. So it's pretty far from the original intent. So one of the examples of what happens when we put tariffs in place was the Tariff Act of 1930, and it's also known as Smoot-Hawley. You probably have heard about that, or maybe you were taught that in school. And it's widely thought to be a major contributor to the Great Depression. So tariffs were thrown up. This Senator Smoot and Senator Hawley were the advocates for this particular tariff act. And they threw up a 20% tariff on 890 incoming items into the US, thinking that it would help US industries be more competitive because it made it artificially, again, look like imports were more expensive. There were a lot of economists at the time that were opposed to these tariffs, but President Hoover signed it anyway. Does any of that sound familiar today? Most economists today are opposed to tariffs, and they were at that time as well. So many countries, as a result, retaliated with their own tariffs, just like we're seeing today, particularly Canada and Mexico, which were our major trading partners back in 1930. And they retaliated with their own high tariffs of 20% or more. And the result was it deepened the Great Depression. And that's because it made goods in the US and for consumers, both imported and domestic production, more expensive. So US citizens had to buy things that were more expensive. They couldn't afford it. That drove demand down by US companies. And when demand is driven down, then you have a resulting layoffs, and then you've got a high unemployment rate. It's a downward spiral, and it caused, or was a major cause of the Great Depression, the global Great Depression. So not just in the United States, but around the world suffered because of this effect on imported goods. And it was a significant foreign policy damage problem as well. So we weren't very popular with the global economies around the world because of these tariffs. And again, that should sound familiar to you and what's happening today. The Trump tariffs, though, are a little bit different. So it's not just to protect US industry. In fact, that's a fairly small portion of what they're trying to do. The Trump administration is trying to force other countries to do what the administration wants, what Trump wants. And those two primary factors are to stop drug shipments from coming across the border and stop illegal immigration. So the Trump administration is saying to these other countries, particularly Mexico and China and Canada, you better stop the drug traffic across the border, or we're going to keep increasing the tariffs. Today, China is up to 60% tariffs. Canada and Mexico, as of next week, are probably going to be at 25%. So the major focus has changed, and now tariffs are used as a weapon to get policy changes in the global environment. They're also an approach to stopping de minimis shipments. So, de minimis is a term that's used for imports that are low value, low cost. So, in the US, that means less than $800 for per shipment. So, for example, if you're buying a Halloween costume off Amazon or maybe some Christmas decorations that are totaling less than $800, those come in really fast through US Customs. They don't have to go through a formal entry process. They get sort of cursory review and pass through very quickly as what is called a de minimis shipment with no duties applied. And that's been going on for the past, say, 15 years or so, primarily because we import so much stuff in the US. We buy a lot of stuff from around the world that's low cost um, off Amazon or maybe Temu or Shine. Those are companies that provide low cost goods, and they come right through because of de minimis shipments. Now, most countries have de minimis as part of their policy, but they're almost always much lower. So, Mexico and Canada have $50 is their de minimis shipment. So the item has to be valued at less than $50. But in the US, we have a very high de minimis, and that's because of the growth of e commerce over the past few years and the influx of inexpensive shipments coming primarily from China. Another approach by the administration is to punish China. In 2018, the Trump administration put a 25% tariff on almost everything coming in from China. There were exemptions made also, but by and large, it was a 25% import penalty tariff to punish China for supplying low cost goods to the US. And that was carried through the Biden administration. And now, in addition to that 25%, the Trump administration has put an additional 20% on top of the 25%. So right now, everything is at 45%. And if you're importing aluminum or steel, that's an additional 15%. So essentially, if you're bringing products in from China, you're paying 45 to 60% on the cost as tariffs to the US. Now, we import 438.9 billion dollars worth of goods from China, which is just incredible. And although, they've taken advantage of low cost consumers in the US, the consumers are the ones who are actually going to suffer. And that's because the cost of these imports is going to go up significantly, as much as 60%. One of the problems, though, with this new policy is that it's very unpredictable. You can see in the background of this slide, I have put in a roller coaster, and that's what it feels like. That their tariffs are on again, off again, on again, off again, and that is very difficult for businesses to deal with. The one thing that we know about businesses, they like to know what's going to happen in advance. They like to have a stable environment so that they can predict how to manage their own companies. And this kind of roller coaster ride is making it very frustrating. Um, because of these policies and these extensive tariffs, prices are going to rise on products all across America. There's no question about that. Yesterday, they announced, the Trump administration announced an additional 25% on automobiles coming from any country in the world. And that's going to put a fairly significant price increase on cars for American consumers. Okay, I'm not going to read this entire slide, but this is an example. Actually, this is as of yesterday. So March 27th. This is what the tariffs are currently. So as I mentioned, 25% additional tariff on all cars, all countries made outside the USA, and that's effective next week. Additional 20% tariff on all Chinese goods. Um, these are all, and so I would also say they're in addition, so they're cumulative. So if you have been importing something at 25%, this is an additional 20% on Chinese goods. And then if it's aluminum and steel, an additional 15% on top of that. There's a 25% tariff on China that was paused until April 2nd, but there is also an additional 10% on energy imports. And so we import a lot of energy from China that has gone into effect already. So it could be up to 35% on some products coming in from Canada. 25% on Mexico. Again, it was paused until next week, till April 2nd. That's on imported aluminum and steel goods are also subject to 232 tariffs, which would be a 15% in addition to the 25%. And then Trump has confirmed he wants to put tariffs, reciprocal tariffs from 15 to 25% on everything coming into the US, no matter the country. So most countries out there are doing some kind of retaliatory measure. So, for example, we might have a 45% tariff on electronics coming from China, and China's going to react or has reacted already with tariffs on farm goods that are exported from the US and imported into China. So while we're taxing or putting tariffs on electronics, the Chinese government is trying to hurt our farmers in retaliation because they think that will make a difference. And right now, our farmers are really hurting, not only because the demand has dropped off. So China is now sourcing a lot of stuff from Brazil, for example, a lot of agricultural goods. But the farmers are also suffering from the closure of USAID. So their sales are down somewhere about 30% year over year, and that's going to be a real problem for farmers going forward. Canada's and Mexico have both also indicated they're going to do retaliatory tariffs. In Canada, Florida, orange juice, appliances, other household items, beer, wine, liquor. Those are the products that Canada has focused on. So the tariffs add cost, but no value to goods crossing the border. And that's an important concept to understand. We don't get anything in exchange for the tariffs. It's just cost that's collected, and then importers absorb that cost or pass it on to consumers. So recently we did a major project for the state of New York where we interviewed 18 senior executives all across America. And we asked them, what strategies are you using or what strategies are you taking to address tariffs? Now, it was a fairly small sample size, but you'll see in this slide that it was very broad on industries. So we looked at semiconductors in Silicon Valley, textiles, power generation, medical devices, and medical equipment. Of course, medical devices are small things like oxygen devices or CPAPs, kind of personal medical devices. Medical equipment is the big machinery that has a setting in a medical office or so forth. Audio equipment. So someone from one of your members from Alti was part of the interview process. Industrial equipment, printing, sports equipment, fuel cells, water equipment, construction. So you can see even though it was a small sample size, we had very broad industry participation. The locations of people where we interviewed was upstate New York, New York City, Maine, Minneapolis, Silicon Valley, Santa Monica, San Diego. So we had cross-country representation as well. So here's a summary of the responses. And I have some graphics I'm going to show you in a minute that I think are more telling than just the percentages here. But essentially, 94% of the companies that we talked to were importing finished goods or intermediate goods and spare parts. And so I would say it was probably 100%. I mean, we did talk to one company was in a lab environment, and they said they were not importing any products, finished goods or intermediate goods. But in a lab environment, they use beakers and test equipment and so forth, and all of that was imported. So essentially, we said 94%, but I think every company was probably doing some importation. All right, well, let me show you the graphs. Well, first, a summary of the responses. I think up in the top right-hand corner, it says notable quotes. And this is a very telling quote. And we heard this a couple of times from executives. This guy said, our capital investments are frozen because we don't know what to expect. We also heard that hiring is frozen as well. And this is a big red flag for recession. So when companies start shutting down their investment and they don't hire anymore, we're going to see a deterioration in labor and employment rates are going to go down. We're going to see, a cascading effect that's going to probably lead us to recession. And I think we're just on the brink of that right now. Uncertainty in the tariffs and geopolitics is creating chaos. As I said before, companies want to rely on a stable environment, and right now that is not the case. Most companies prefer, or would like to manufacture in the US, but they can't make the economics work. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that structure and how to determine whether you can or can't manufacture here in a little bit. Um, Lots of companies are increasing domestic sourcing, and they recognize they're going to have to raise prices to customers. So some companies are stuck, and other companies are actually moving forward with different strategies. Some are preparing multiple alternative approaches and what if scenarios, and we highly recommend that you do that. You need to be prepared for a lot of things that may happen in the next period. I would say the next, this month through the next about 2 or 3 years. I think we're going to see a lot of changes in the global manufacturing environment. Assessing geopolitical risks. So it's really important, especially these people at C-level in organizations are saying they're watching what's happening in geopolitics very, very closely. Our semiconductor executive told us that China and Taiwan are particularly of note, primarily because this company is designing semiconductors in the US, but when they go to production, they're being produced by TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company in Taiwan. And there's a clear and present threat by China to take over Taiwan. And if and when that happens, and I should say when, I think it's very likely, excuse me, when it happens, China is likely to shut down manufacturing of semiconductors in Taiwan that are going to the US. So they may stop that production for semiconductors coming to the US. And man, that is a big deal. We are very dependent on semiconductors. If you just think semiconductors are in everything. Um, I dropped the plug to my hair dryer the other day on the bathroom floor, and it sort of exploded into a lot of parts. So it was the plug part of it in the little black box. And there, sure enough, there is a semiconductor in it. I mean, semiconductors are in all kinds of household appliances. They're in heating and cooling systems. They're in our cell phones. They're in our cars. They're everywhere. And we do not have the capability to manufacture enough of those semiconductors in the US. although we have a investment under the Infrastructure Act that is ongoing in the US to build semiconductor factories, but it'll be 5 to 10 years before those come online. And when they do, there's no way they're going to be able to meet the demand. So this is a very big risk area, and we're very vulnerable as a result. A lot of the companies told us they were moving manufacturing to alternate low-cost countries such as Mexico, India, and Vietnam. And they were increasing domestic sourcing and reshoring manufacturing to the US, which is our favorite since we're the Reshoring Institute, and working with forwarders and brokers for various strategies on tariffs. Okay, so here's some graphical representation. As I mentioned before, 94% of the companies told us they were importing either finished goods or intermediate goods. Most companies are either absorbing costs, so 72% said they were absorbing the costs, and 82% said they were passing on the cost to customers. So guess what? Our products that we buy every day in America are going to increase in costs. So somewhere between 25 and 60% more expensive over the next couple years. It's coming. Some companies were using foreign trade zones. If you're not familiar with FTZs, these are physically located in the US, but they're considered outside the customs territory of the US. So, what companies can do is bring in products into a foreign trade zone and then keep them there, store them there, or sometimes there's some light manufacturing going on there, and when they're ready to import those products into the US, they physically move them out of the foreign trade zone and into wherever they're going from there into the US economy. So they file the import when they take it out of that physical location of the FTCs. There are foreign trade zones all across America. You may have seen signs for them before, and they're essentially just big warehouses that are housing goods that have not been officially imported into the US. And the reason why companies would use an FTC, particularly now, is this thing called a privileged FTC import. And that means if I'm buying something from China today, I might pay a 45% import tariff on it. But some of the, some of the tariffs may apply later. So, for example, if I import something today and it's at 45%, and then the tariff goes up next week, I can still import that product out of the FTC at the lower rate, so the original rate, and that's called a privileged import. And so companies bought inventory, placed it in the FTC, and are taking advantage of privileged imports as a result. That's a short-term strategy. It's not really going to help in the long term, but it is a way of saving some money. So 67% of the clients told us, our executives told us that they were looking for more domestic sources. Trying to source more in the US can be difficult. We usually tell our clients it takes 18 months to redevelop a supply chain in the US. 78% of the companies said they're looking for alternate sources in new locations around the world, that is. So, actually moving from China mostly to other countries around the world. 44% of the companies said they were moving out of China. So, lots of the companies are pursuing a China plus one strategy. So, they're keeping some manufacturing in China and moving some to other countries, probably low-cost countries such as Mexico, India, or Vietnam. So this is the percentage of companies that are moving to those locations. You can see here around 25 to 30% are moving to Mexico and to India, and then to other countries, including Vietnam, is a slightly lower percentage. Vietnam was very popular for a while, but they only have 95 million people in Vietnam, and their factories are full. So that's kind of on hold for now, I guess. India has its own set of problems, and not only infrastructure problems, energy problems, but if you're sending container loads of goods, they're on the water in sea freight for an additional 2 weeks on average until it can reach a U.S. port. And that means you've got 2 weeks worth of investment and inventory on the water and delays in filling orders. Mexico has certain advantages because of its proximity to the US, but there are risks there too in terms of crime and the potential now risk for retaliatory tariffs. 22% of the companies told us they were redesigning their products, re-engineering the products to eliminate foreign parts if possible. That's one interesting approach to try to get more US content. And as you may know, if you're selling to the US government, the content of your products has to be around 65%. Under some of the acts, like the Infrastructure Act, that content requirement is way more, up to about 95%. So if you can redesign your product to eliminate those foreign parts, that's probably a good idea. Then we finally asked about additional concerns. So cybersecurity was mentioned again and again and again. I think that's always on people's minds. But look at the tallest bar there. So that is a big concern is retaliatory tariffs by other countries on U.S. exports. So this means that not only are we dealing with import tariffs and additional costs, but now, because of those retaliatory tariffs, it is devastating export markets as well. So companies that are trying to export their products are going to find resistance because of the retaliatory tariffs and an increased cost there. So we're going to see, I think, a result is going to be a deterioration of demand for export products over the next period. Sole sourcing concerns were always highlighted, trying to eliminate sole sources and have alternate sources around the world. And then finally, can't find workers. That's a common theme as well. Really difficult right now because of our low unemployment, but I think that's about to change as well. We're going to find there's lots of people unemployed, either former government workers or because demand is dipping, that there'll be more people available. On the other hand, because companies are not hiring, we're sort of caught in a trap there. Okay, so how do you respond to the tariffs? So some recommendations. First and foremost is to stay abreast of the news on tariffs. And I know that's really hard. It's hard to remember all the tariffs and all the issues that are going back and forth or on pause or unpaused or new tariffs. But important to stay abreast of it and understand how that's going to affect your business. Work with your customs broker. That's kind of popped up, and a lot of senior executives never got involved in the day-to-day operations of import export until recently. And now we know that there is visibility at the highest level in organizations regarding import tariffs, classifications, the potential for duty drawback. And by the way, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, new tariffs that are placed on imported goods are not available for duty drawback. So duty drawback happens when you import goods and then you re-export them or destroy them in the US. And you can claim a refund of those duties, but not on the additional tariffs. So there's no availability of duty drawback on most of the new tariffs. The use of foreign trade zones is another idea, and other trade strategies. I have some detailed slides following this presentation that may be helpful if you're interested in any of those. Preparing multiple alternatives, as I mentioned, that's high on our list. We always coach our clients, develop plan B, plan C, plan D in detail so that you have a plan readily available should you need to switch to a different manufacturing location. Put those detailed steps in place, write them up, also a timeline and a budget. And I think a lot of times companies overlook the idea of budgeting for such a change as well. Assess the geopolitical risks, particularly China and Taiwan. Prepare a plan to source elsewhere if you need to. Move manufacturing to alternate low cost countries out of China to places like Mexico, India, and Vietnam. Aggressively look for US sources of parts and develop new domestic suppliers. And then, of course, our favorite, reshore manufacturing to the US. Lots of changes ahead. You got to stay in touch and deal with those changes. This is our website, reshoringinstitute.org, and we publish all of our research there, all of our case studies, our surveys, everything is there. It's all free, it's all downloadable. We provide this as a public service. So I would encourage you to go and have a look there. There may be several items of interest to you. Okay, just briefly, I'm going to go through the appendix, and this particular presentation is also available, I think, as of next week. So you'll be able to download it if you're interested in this detail. Here I've gone through US customs strategies, a substantial transformation. That means bringing a product into the US or transforming it in another location. So the classic example is importing a log from the Pacific Northwest, a tree or a log, into Mexico, and then Mexico, the factory in Mexico makes a bedpost out of it or some kind of furniture. So what happens there is the essential essence of the product is changed. So the product goes from a log to a furniture. And that also represents a tariff shift, and that would be considered a substantial transformation. Sometimes that means that the tariff is less on the new product than it was on the previous product. So something to consider. Duty engineering is looking at the harmonized tariff codes and understanding if you can make a strategic shift in how you're importing or describing products. Another classic example is I have a guy that used to work for me and a good friend that used to work at Mattel, and he had an opportunity to engineer the duty on Barbies and Barbie cases. So originally, Barbie cases were being brought in as a piece of luggage, actually. So they were termed luggage and had a duty rate on it, I think about 13%. And they looked at that and decided this Barbie case isn't really a piece of luggage, it's a toy. And so they were able to reclassify it as toys that came in duty free. Reclassifying your harmonized tariff number, I would recommend that you look at your harmonized tariff classifications on a regular basis, at least once a year, to make sure they're still valid, or that your product might be classified in a different way that would reduce your duty. Duty drawback, we've already talked about. First sale is when first sale is maybe selling aluminum to a broker who then resells it to a customer in the US. Well, under the first sale rules, you can apply the lower duty or duty on the lower cost, the first sale cost from the manufacturer to the broker, which is without their market, without the broker's markup. And so essentially you end up paying less duty. Foreign trade zones, we've already talked about as well. Relocation strategies, where should you go? Here's a list of likely places and some places that we've dealt with our clients. Mexico and Canada under the current USMCA. Of course, that's going to change if the new duties are applicable after April 2nd. Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia are alternate low-cost countries, and so is India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Taiwan and South Korea are more sophisticated, particularly in electronics, uh, but it's more expensive to manufacture there or to source products from there. Uh, Contract manufacturing is a very viable alternative. We encourage companies that are thinking about relocating to consider contract manufacturing. A lot of these CMs already have established manufacturing in multiple worldwide locations, and it is possible for them to shift manufacturing from China, say, to Mexico or Indonesia or somewhere else. So having alternate locations to potentially build your product gives you a lot of flexibility. There are some key factors to being successful in manufacturing in a contract manufacturing environment. There are certainly issues with it, and you have to pay for the manufacturing services, but it's a very good, I think, alternative to just having one location where you're manufacturing today. Inventory and domestic sourcing. Look at the notable quote in the upper right. It says, we're asking our Chinese suppliers to give us a discount. And so sharing the duty rate. So if the duty rate is 45% on incoming Chinese goods from China into the US, then this particular company is asking the Chinese supplier to split the difference. So instead of 45% paying 22.5%, by the US importer and then taking a 22.5% on the goods by the Chinese supplier. I think that's an interesting strategy. I hope you can make it work. A lot of Chinese vendors right now and suppliers are desperate because there's been such a downturn in Chinese manufacturing. So you might be able to negotiate this kind of deal with them. Building inventory is a short-term solution. So you can bring inventory in now and hopefully take advantage of lower tariff rates, but then you have additional investment in working capital that's just sitting there until you're ready to use the products. You can avoid future increases in the tariffs by bringing in inventory now, but you also risk obsolescence and shelf life issues. I don't know if you know or not, but most electronics have a shelf life. And if you have to store those for a while, they may be beyond that shelf life. You're also going to have to pay for additional warehouse space. Um, and I think it's really a short-term solution. It's not going to solve your problem long-term. Redeveloping a supply chain base in the US, as I mentioned before, can take up to 18 months. Reshoring and nearshoring strategies. These are what we advocate for is to, first of all, determine your cost structure and how much of your product cost is attributable to labor. If labor is more than 50% of the cost, then you probably need to look for a low-cost alternative country, such as Mexico, Vietnam, or India, and keep your production offshore to take advantage of those low-cost labor environments. If labor is a smaller percentage of the cost and you can automate where you possibly can, then you have the ability to potentially move manufacturing back to the US. We just finished a major study on minimum wages in the US. It's on our landing page if you're interested. And it identifies places in the US where the labor costs are relatively low. So, there are some very high places like New York City and San Francisco. San Francisco, the minimum wage is over $20 an hour, but places like Alabama and Mississippi, the wage is 7.25. That's the federal minimum standard. So you may be able to find a location where labor costs are going to make it economically viable for you to remanufacture in the U.S. There are also incentives and funding out there in federal, state, and local communities to support reshoring. Uh, and you need to also pay attention to Made in USA labeling requirements. It's not exactly straightforward. It's harder than you think to be able to label your products made in the USA. So you need to research that, and that's something that we have helped a lot of clients with also in the past. And certainly reach out for assistance from the Reshoring Institute. We do site selection, supply based development, and consulting to help bring manufacturing back to America. Okay, and this is once again contact information. Reshoringinstitute.org is our website. It's a very big website with lots of information there. So I hope you'll enjoy anything that you can download from there. So that's my presentation. Barry, back to you. Are there any questions?
Yes, there are. First, thank you. Excellent presentation. We appreciate it. I'm personally disappointed that you did not have the magic formula to solve all of this, but we'll have to take what we can get, right?
That's right.
Um, so again, specific to our industry, you talked a lot about strategy of stocking up prior to the tariffs, but the flip side of that is that a lot of people are predicting a recession, which means that you could be stocking up on a lot of inventory that could be sitting there for a lot longer than you might think. Is there a way to approach this logically?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, I don't know. Um, yeah, so I mean, in the short term, I mean, recession isn't going, it's not like falling off a cliff. So, recession and a lack of demand will happen over time. So if you're building some inventory up now, stocking up now, um, just try not to do it too much in advance, so that you can sell off that inventory going forward. But I think longer term, it's probably not a good strategy to bring in a whole bunch of inventory. Like I wouldn't recommend to my clients that they bring in 2 or 3 years worth of inventory, but bringing in maybe 3 or 4 months worth of inventory might be an okay strategy. You'll have some savings as a result of that. It's really a short-term strategy.
Yeah, long-term strategies seem to be very much up in the air at the moment, since the entire tariff issue seems to be up in the air at the moment. Um, Another question, as you're probably aware, in a strange twist of our tariff policy, um, assembled loudspeakers imported from China pay a lower tariff rate than the parts that U.S. manufacturers need to use to assemble them. And by the way, in most cases, U.S. manufacturers have no choice. There is nowhere in the United States to buy the parts. I know several people have tried to lobby Congress to take a look at this and trying. Is there a pathway that manufacturers should be taking to try and address this? It's obviously unfair.
Yeah, I'm aware of the finished product import conundrum in audio speakers and in other industries as well. There are a few other examples out there. Um, is there a way? Probably not. I would say the other thing is that even though the tariff rate may be lower on finished goods or zero on finished goods right now from China, that's not so in the future. So that 20% additional tariff is going to apply to everything coming from China, and potentially more than that also. So Trump may put additional tariffs on China to stop those imports from coming in. So you're likely to see some tariff even on finished goods coming from China. I think a better strategy is to do the very hard work to find suppliers or develop suppliers in other places in the world. It's not going to be easy. You may have to really dig to find companies that are willing to make a part that they haven't made in the past, either in the U.S. or potentially Mexico. Mexico is a fairly good industrial base, but you're going to have to work at it, and there are going to be stumbling blocks. It's not going to be easy like sourcing from China has been over the past 10 or 15 years. But the truth is, there's going to be tariffs on China and an anti-China sentiment over the next period under the Trump administration, and it's not going to get any better. Our relationship with China has suffered, as well as we're going to see continuous import strategies against importing from China.
You're just cheering me up with every
Oh.
one of these.
Sorry about that. It's not my nature to be so depressing, but I think that's a situation that we're in.
It is what it is. The last question I have for you really is kind of one that I came up with, because I know that your presentation in general relates to the U.S. market and to reshoring, nearshoring, and doing business in the United States. But I just wanted to point out, and hopefully you reiterate, a lot of this also applies to other places in the world. It's not just us. We are an international trade association, so certainly we have relationships in Europe and Asia and other places around the world. And I just wanted you to reiterate, a lot of these strategies are the same regardless of what country you're in.
Yeah, yeah, I would say, staying attuned to what's happening in geopolitics is really important. And if you're in another country, watching what the US is doing and being able to respond to that. But yeah, other countries have tariffs that they're considering or increasing or lowering. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of sourcing by Chinese companies in Brazil. There are a lot of Chinese companies that are moving to Mexico. I mean, I've been in the global supply chain management for 40 years, and I've never seen this much movement. People are really rethinking their global strategies, and they need to. You have to do that hard work to protect yourself. I mean, otherwise, you're going to find, you're not going to be able to get goods from China, or they're going to be just uber expensive, and you'll lose your market as a result of that. So, really thinking through these alternatives, laying them out, putting some detailed plans together, putting a budget together is really important part of doing business today in every industry.
Wise words. And just to anyone who's watching, so we will make the PowerPoint presentation available through a link on our website and in our newsletter next week. And the entire presentation will also be available on YouTube, again, probably early next week. And otherwise, we thank you very much. Thanks for everyone who attended, and thank you very much for a great presentation, Rosemary.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And we will talk to you soon.